Hey everybody, KMO here, and I am the host of a long-running podcast, started actually in 2006, called the C-Realm Podcast. But in 2012, after doing the C-Realm Podcast basically for free, I got donations, but they weren't reliable income. After doing it for free for 6 years, I started a second podcast called the C-Realm Vault Podcast, where subscribers would pay $8 a month to have, a second podcast, weekly podcast from me. Well, the free podcast has kind of withered on the vine. Most of my podcasting efforts these days now go to the C-Realm Vault Podcast, which is to say the subscriber-only podcast. And there's over 350 episodes in the vault. And I'm going to bring one out and share it with people on YouTube. This is a conversation that I recorded in January 2016 with Keith Preston. Now, cast yourself back to January of 2016. The election was months away. People were confident that Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee, which she was, but she hadn't locked it up yet. So this is before Trump's presidency, before his election, really before Trump was the Republican nominee for the election. And Keith Preston, well, I cannot begin to preview or summarize all the topics that we cover in this interview, mostly that Keith covers. He'll be doing most of the talking. But I'm bringing this episode out of the vault and sharing it with the world thanks to a C-Realm Vault subscriber who remembered hearing this episode back in 2016 and wanted to bring it to people's attention and say, hey, this one is worth a second listen. So let me read the comment that this listener posted. He writes, "This interview by KMO of Keith Preston, while a bit long-winded on Keith's part, is a Vault classic and deserves to be listened to again in light of the events of May to July 2020. Keith's remarks are as prescient as ever. His development of the concept of totalitarian humanism hits the mark." All right, so here is the first part. This interview is an hour and a half long. I'm breaking it up into 3 videos of about half an hour each. This is the first of 3. Enjoy. You are listening to the C-Realm Podcast. I'm your host, KMO, and I'm speaking with Keith Preston of Attack the System. Keith, welcome to the C-Realm Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I have been listening to your podcasts. I live in New York City. My children live in Baltimore or near Baltimore, and I have to drive there every now and again to visit them. And so I have a lot of time to listen to big chunks of people's archives, podcast archives. So just recently I listened to probably 3 or 4 of your shows over the course of a couple of days. And they're pretty dense, I have to say, and erudite, very impressive. And I feel like I have been enriched by those drives.
Oh, well, thank you.
You have a great turn of phrase that I want to get around to, and that is totalitarian humanism. But rather than dive right into that, I would like to invite you to just say more about your general project of the work that you do with podcasting and writing.
Well, I am the chief editor of a website called Attack the System, or attackthesystem.com, and I am the co-founder and I guess the director of a tendency called American Revolutionary Vanguard. And what we are is basically a dissident tendency within the anarchist milieu in North America. I have been involved in dissident politics in the United States since the 80s. And for a good number of years, I was a part of the radical left. And then I eventually started to question certain things about the radical left and its effectiveness as a genuine oppositional force in the United States and in other places as well. And it appeared to me that the left had essentially been overrun by liberalism, that the so-called radical left was just an extension of liberalism. And so I started developing a more eclectic philosophy. I started looking at other movements and other tendencies and other philosophical systems. And what we have going on at Attack the System is a dissident tendency in anarchism. Most of the anarchist movement, at least in North America, is sort of a youth culture, and often it's oriented just as much towards fashion styles and music and things like that as it is politics. But the more politically serious component of it tends to be just standard left progressive issues. If you listen to these people talk or read their material, listen to their podcasts or whatever, they sound like academic leftists. They sound like the kind of thing you would hear in a university humanities department. They're all talking about privilege theory and white privilege, and they're talking about the patriarchy and homophobia and some other issues like that. The standard social justice warrior paradigm. And that's not as much what we focus on at Attack the System. At Attack the System, we're focused on things that the historic anarchist movement was focused on, which is opposition to imperialism. Anarchists were anti-imperialist, revolutionary anti-imperialist long before the Marxists got in on the game. The anarchists were among the early organizers of the historic labor movement, the historic working class struggle. Anarchists obviously have a critique of the state that is unique and that you don't find in other political philosophies. And we're trying to reclaim some of that legacy. The fact that anarchists were the leading revolutionary tendency throughout the world in the late 19th century and early 20th century is extremely significant as well. And that's the legacy and heritage that we claim. Now, we also modify the anarchist philosophy a little bit. We're not saying let's turn the clock back to 1900. Obviously, we can't do that. But what we do is we take the same general framework, the same basic set of ideas, and we try to modify them and apply them within a 21st century context. And that's what Attack the System is about.
You mentioned that the left has been overtaken by liberalism, and liberalism is a stretchy word. What do you mean by it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, historically, the left, going back to the early 19th century, is socialism, communism, anti-capitalism. The idea to leftists that existed prior to World War II, perhaps even sooner, perhaps prior to the 1960s, the idea that you could have a capitalist left would have been considered a joke. Historically, the left is anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism and things like that. Now, what we have seen happen to the left in the last half a century is that the left has been slowly overtaken by the cultural liberalism that emerged during that time period, during the post-war late 20th century time period. And out of that, we see this fixation on things like identity politics of different types, race identity politics, gender identity politics, gay identity politics, and all sorts of single issues of different types, ranging from animal rights to environmentalism to, the crusades against smoking or whatever. That's really what the left is today, or what passes for the left. Liberalism. I heard Ralph Nader describe the left this way fairly recently. Ralph Nader said that the left today is just basically a coalition of special interest groups or a coalition of groups organized around single issues, their own individual single issues. And there's nothing oppositional about any of this. None of this threatens the system in any way. In fact, the system is more than happy to incorporate all of this stuff into its paradigm, and we see that happening. Every kind of political system that exists has to have some sort of ideological superstructure that is used to justify it. Whether it's in the ancient world where they said that the emperor is a direct descendant of the sun god, or whether it's divine right of kings in the Middle Ages, or whether it's the dictatorship of the proletariat or the people's will or whatever. All systems have to have some means of self-legitimation. They have to be able to persuade their subjects that they are somehow justified in their system of rule. And increasingly what we see happening in Western countries is we see this thing that I call totalitarian humanism emerging, which is sort of an outgrowth of this kind of cultural liberalism that I was describing earlier. You see that being incorporated into the system's ideological superstructure, where the system legitimates its own system of rule by claiming to be fighting against racism and sexism and for democracy and human rights and things of that nature. For example, when the United States launches a war of aggression against Libya, what we see is the Obama administration claiming they're fighting for democracy and human rights, or when the George W. Bush administration launches an invasion of Iraq where they claim they're trying to bring some kind of what they called a freedom agenda to the Iraqis. And that's just an obvious example. When it comes to domestic policy, an analogy I like to use is to some of the blue nose movements that existed in past times. If you look at American history, for example, you see there were people like Anthony Comstock who used to crusade against the supposed dissemination of obscenity through the postal service, and what he was really worried about were books about contraceptive methods and things like that, which he considered to be pornographic. Or in the 1950s, you had a big hysteria in the United States over comic books. You actually had congressional hearings about comic books and how comic books were undermining the moral fiber of society. Of course, you've also had the McCarthyism, the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s as well. In the 1980s, we saw the satanic panic and how there were supposedly satanic cults out there abducting and molesting children or engaging in human sacrifice. And there used to be a thing like that, a variation of things like that, where people were concerned about hidden satanic messages in records in rock music. If you played songs backward, you could hear a message from the devil. Or in the 70s and 80s, you had this group, the Moral Majority, that emerged, and they were known for their blue nose approach to a lot of things. One of their leaders used to say that cartoon characters were promoting homosexuality and children's the gay agenda and all of that kind of stuff. And what I see happening today is the same thing, only coming from the left. I see increasingly you see people out there engaging in exactly these same kinds of tactics, only the issues aren't pornography or homosexuality or things that are considered demons to people on the right, as much as it's things like racism, sexism, homophobia, and then they keep throwing on all these new forms of phobias and isms and archies. There's the patriarchy, there's the Islamophobia, there's xenophobia, there's transphobia, there's speciesism, and they keep adding on looksism, ageism, heightism, weightism, whatever. And increasingly we see a type of left-wing McCarthyism coming out of this. One example was the fellow who was the CEO of the Mozilla internet company a few years back, I guess. Apparently, the fellow's name was Brendan Eich, and apparently he had made a donation to a group that opposed gay marriage or something like that. So he was dismissed from his position as CEO for having having opposed gay marriage years earlier. And that's just one example as well. And we can find plenty of examples like that if we look really hard. And it's interesting that these people, these social justice warriors, claim to represent the oppressed and persecuted. And yet someone like Anita Sarkeesian is able to get an audience in front of the UN over the issue of cyberbullying and things like that. I mean, somebody that's oppressed doesn't get an audience in front of the UN. I don't get to go speak to the UN about any of my personal problems. That really, I think, shows a great deal about where these people are coming from, that the people who really push this line, this social justice warrior nonsense, or whatever we want to call it, are largely people from the privileged classes, or relatively privileged classes, and they define all of these bizarre things as oppression because they're really not oppressed. People who are genuinely oppressed, aren't concerned about these kinds of topics.
What sort of topics are people who are genuinely oppressed usually concerned with?
Well, there's a certain hierarchy when it comes to what we might call oppression or whatever. Obviously, as any psychologist will tell you, or any biologist will tell you, the basic needs of most human beings are in the realm of material survival. And food, shelter, these kinds of things. And people who are oppressed are people who are unable to achieve these things. Obviously, there's different levels of that as well. I'm a sociologist, and one of the things that we use to classify different types of poverty is to make a distinction between relative and absolute poverty. But the kind of poverty that you find in what we call the third world is absolute poverty. That's poverty that's life-threatening. Much of the poverty that we find in a society like the United States is more in the realm of relative poverty, where you have people who aren't as well off as other people, or people who are perhaps struggling, but it's not an immediate threat to their survival. Although increasingly that is becoming the case in the United States. We do see class divisions widening enormously. We do see poverty growing in a lot of ways, including more severe forms of poverty than what we've normally been accustomed to, at least for quite a while. So that's one issue, basic material survival. Another is outright state repression, when the state can come and kill you, throw you in jail, and do other things to you because they don't like who you are or what you do. Increasingly, that is becoming very pervasive in the United States. There's a number of writers out there, John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, Radley Balco, who writes for the Washington Post, William Norman Grigg, who is sort of an independent blogger with kind of a libertarian perspective. All of these fellows have documented very extensively the growth of the police state in this country and routine acts of violence that are carried out by the police against private citizens. And I'm not talking about cases where there's police brutality of an actual criminal. I mean, we can leave those cases out if we want for the sake of discussion. For example, you have a person that's genuinely committing a crime. The police arrest this person, and perhaps the suspect gets into a fight with the cops, and there's a scuffle between the cops, and the cops go overboard with the use of batons or even lethal force or something like that. Even without considering these kinds of cases, we're starting to see more and more cases where we have people who were entirely innocent who have been threatened by the police state, or we have people killed because of an instance of a mistaken identity. Like I said, these kinds of things are increasingly becoming pervasive, and writers like John Whitehead, like William Norman Grigg, like Radley Balco, and plenty of others have documented this. There are about 80,000 SWAT team raids on private homes every year in the United States. 30 years ago, we had maybe 3,000. And SWAT teams used to be used for things like hostage situations and things where something like that might actually be appropriate. Increasingly, SWAT teams are being used for just routine drug busts and for even for other things. I read once about a case where somehow there was a SWAT team investigating the fact that some kid had committed student loan fraud or something of that nature. So we see this growing police state, and we see this massive prison system that's built up around it. The United States has 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoner population. Now, there's only two explanations for that. One is that Americans are a uniquely evil, predatory class of people, or the other is that we simply got too many laws and too much state repression. So material interest, direct state repression of the type I just described. Of course, I haven't even gotten into things like the Patriot Act and its provisions, or the National Defense Authorization Act and its provisions, and things like that, which have to do with terror war issues. And then, of course, there's foreign policy. And if we look at the legacy of American policy in recent decades, we see that the United States has created one disaster after another around the world. And we see that the United States has contributed to the death of large numbers of people throughout parts of the world. Even if we believe the most conservative data about the number of casualties that were generated by the war in Iraq, it's well into the six figures. What we see going on in Syria today is largely an outgrowth of American foreign policy, the growth of the Islamic State and the kind of terrorism and repression that's going on in Syria, and the refugee crisis and all of that. These are issues that a serious left would be concerned about. A serious political left in the United States, or in the Western world generally, would be primarily concerned about all of the things that I have just described. And instead, what we have is a left that is concerned about things like gender, the use of gender pronouns, somebody called he or she in a way that they deemed inappropriate, or things of that nature. Or we see the left raising the bar to where the tiniest personal slight can somehow be dismissed as oppression. You called somebody a bad name. You said a bad word. You said something that could be remotely interpreted as a racial slur or a sexist remark or an anti-gay slur or something like that. And that's not to say that things like that don't really happen. I mean, there really are people that are racist. There really are people that are homophobic. There really are people that are sexist. There is such a thing. Um, but increasingly, what we see among the so-called left, and really this kind of thing dominates the entire range of the left today, ranging from liberal Democrats to the far left. Virtually the entire spectrum of the left, or what passes for the left, is pervasively dominated by this kind of thinking. Even if you read the magazines of American communist organizations, you see that much of their focus is on things like transgender issues or LGBT, gay marriage, and so forth. In fact, I knew a fellow who belonged to the American Communist Party who resigned over these kinds of issues because the bulk of their focus was towards this kind of thing rather than issues pertaining to working class struggle or anti-imperialism or anything of that nature.
Well, my next couple of questions might seem unrelated to what you're talking about, but in my mind, they are related. And I think as we move forward, the connections will become clear to the listeners. But you have mentioned in some of your podcasts, and they might not be recent podcasts, but they're recent in my mind because I've listened to them recently, that the neoconservatives or the neocons originated in the Democratic Party and then switched over to the Republican Party, and you can envision them switching back to the Democratic Party. Would you say more about that?
Yes, well, the neoconservatives are a movement that actually has their roots not in the Democratic Party, but if you want to trace it back far enough, they have their roots in the far left. They have their roots in Trotskyism. For listeners that aren't familiar with what Trotskyism is, it's a branch of communism that developed roughly in the 1930s. Leon Trotsky was a Russian revolutionary. He was one of the participants in the Russian Revolution of 1917, and he was one of the associates of Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union. After Lenin died in the 1920s, there was a rivalry for power about who was going to succeed Lenin. We all know that Joseph Stalin came out the victor in that struggle, but one of the contenders was Leon Trotsky. And because Trotsky was defeated by Stalin in the struggle for power. Trotsky obviously went into exile, and he actually lived in Mexico and was organizing the Trotskyist movement, which is sort of an opposition in exile to Stalinism in Russia. And in the United States, there was a Trotskyite movement that was pro-Trotsky, and then you also had the American Communist Party that was pro-Stalin. But then there was a faction within Trotskyism, led by a guy named Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was actually a personal associate of Trotsky. But over time, throughout between the 1930s up through the 1960s, the Shachtmanites, the followers of this guy, sort of moved to the right. They started taking an increasingly anti-Soviet line on anti-Stalinist grounds, and for that reason, they actually started supporting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, which was rare for leftists back then. I mean, even for anti-Stalinist leftists. So they started developing a pro-Cold War position. They even started defending things like the war in Vietnam. In fact, some of the other people on the left in those days used to call them the State Department Socialists because they took the State Department line on the war in Vietnam. But they also started a political party called Social Democrats USA, which was a minor party in the United States, which was as the name implies, it was a democratic socialist party, but actually had hawkish right-wing foreign policy views. And the neoconservative movement started to move away from the left altogether in the late 60s and early 70s, largely as a reaction to the new left. They did not like the anti-Americanism of the new left, the fact that the more radical strands of the new left tended to sympathize with, say, the Viet Cong or with Fidel Castro or figures like that. They also, in particular, did not like the pro-Palestinian stance of the new left. Many early neoconservatives were Jewish ethnics and were therefore, because of that, very pro-Israel and pro-Zionist, if you will. So this really marks the split between the neocons, what becomes the neoconservatives, which are these right-wing Trotskyites, for lack of a better term, or right-wing social democrats, for lack of a better term. That marks the split between them and the radical left. And then they were supporters of conservative Democrats, or Democrats with conservative foreign policy views at one point. They were big fans of Henry Jackson, who was a U.S. senator who was who was very conservative on foreign policy, but he was also a New Deal Democrat. And that was a tradition that you used to see a lot of in American politics back then. You would see Democrats who were very liberal on economic policy, were staunch supporters of the New Deal, the Great Society, all of these kinds of things, but had very hawkish views on foreign policy. They were very anti-Soviet. They were against third world revolutionary movements. They were very pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian. But in the 70s, when the McGovernite Democrats, when the new left that came out of the 60s starts moving into the Democratic Party and taking over a lot of the apparatus of the Democratic Party, and bringing some of these ideas, some of these more liberal ideas into or far left ideas into the Democratic Party. You see the neocons, the neoconservatives starting to move right, and they actually start supporting the Republicans. And in particular, in the 70s and 80s, you had the rise of the religious right in the United States, which is a religious subculture that, for whatever reason, has a theological outlook that's actually very pro-Israel for entirely different reasons than what the neocons would have had. But they made for interesting allies of convenience, because you had this very hardcore Christian fundamentalist movement that was pro-Israel for one set of reasons, and this formerly leftist, formerly far left, moving rightward, hawkish foreign policy movement that's very pro-Israel for other reasons. So the right-wing social democrats started calling themselves neoconservatives, and today they will actually deny that there is such a thing as neoconservatives. In fact, Jonah Goldberg, who writes for National Review, actually published a piece recently saying, well, the term neoconservative, that's outdated. Yeah, it maybe meant something at one point, but there was really no such thing as a neoconservative movement, which is nonsensical if you follow the paper trail, because the founders of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, for example, who coined the term neoconservatism, was himself a former Trotskyite. One of the other leading figures that helped form neoconservatism was Norman Podhoretz, who had been an editor of a New Left journal in the early 60s. And these were guys who moved to the right, largely over some of these issues I just described: support for Israel, support for the Vietnam War, support for the Cold War. So these fellows started moving rightward, started becoming Republicans. They continued to have more liberal social views. They tended to be fine with the welfare state. They weren't traditional conservatives or libertarians who were constantly criticizing the excesses of the welfare state. These people were fine with the social welfare state that came out of the New Deal. They were more culturally liberal. They were, pro civil rights for black folks. They had no problem with Martin Luther King or any of that kind of thing. So they were, liberals on most issues, except they tended to be very conservative or right wing, if you will, on foreign policy. Very hawkish when it came to the Cold War, when it came to Middle Eastern issues. So they eventually moved into the Republican Party. And in the 80s, you start seeing these people sort of forming an alliance with the so-called conservative movement. The conservative movement was something that emerged in the 1950s, and its leading figure, its leading intellectual, was William F. Buckley, and it was centered around National Review magazine. And a lot of its financial support came from the Sun Belt, like the industrial interest in the southern and western part of the United States, as opposed to the so-called northeastern establishment. But this was the conservative movement was also very hawkish on foreign policy, very anti-communist. They were tended to be more conservative on economic issues. They wanted to keep the minimum wage low, protect the right to work. But somewhere in the 1980s, these two movements, the neoconservatives and the conservative movement, started to converge. In particular, William F. Buckley and guys like Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz started becoming buddy-buddy, and you start to see a sort of a hybrid conservatism emerge. It's sort of a mixture of all this. And the neoconservatives and their friends and followers and allies started embedding themselves in all of the major right-wing think tanks and Republican Party organizations and issue-based groups, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, all of this kind of stuff. And in particular, the neoconservatives wanted to control the money. They wanted to control all the money that was coming in to these right-wing organizations from donors. And essentially, the neoconservatives were able to take over conservative politics in the United States, and there's what some people now call conservatism incorporated, which is like this mainstream conservative movement we have today. That's you see it on Fox News, you hear it on talk radio and that kind of stuff, and that's really neoconservatism. It's really the neoconservatives that set the tone for the character of that movement and its issues and that kind of thing. It's certainly its leadership at the top level. And of course, when George W. Bush became president, you had these neoconservatives embedding themselves in the Bush administration, and they were some of the principal architects of the war in Iraq. They didn't do it by themselves, but there were others but they were certainly key figures in this. So that's the neoconservatives, and they're still around. They have magazines like National Review. That's a neoconservative magazine today. Weekly Standard, that's one of their magazines. And if you've ever read one of these publications, you see that they're basically a movement that pushes a very hard-line, militarist, hawkish perspective on foreign policy. On social issues, they often kowtow to a lot of the more social conservative, pro-life, anti-gay marriage movements, although they're widely criticized by social conservatives for not being sincere in some of this, and that's probably the case. And also when it comes to economic issues, they'll sort of pretend to be libertarians or conservatives on economics, and then they'll turn around and say, well, the welfare state's here to stay. So they kind of try to work both ends against the middle on those kinds of issues. What they're really concerned about is foreign policy. Now, one thing that characterizes these neoconservatives is their opportunism, and they would gladly go back to being Democrats as they once were if they thought that was what was most opportune at the particular time. And in fact, many of these people are actually quite sympathetic to Hillary Clinton. And I suspect that if Mrs. Clinton were to become the next president of the United States, we would see some of these neocons trying to embed themselves in the Clinton administration and all of a sudden become quite friendly to the Clinton administration. I suspect we'll start seeing editorials in Weekly Standard and National Review saying, well, maybe Mrs. Clinton isn't so bad after all. And the reason for that would be that Hillary's likely to take a fairly hawkish position on a lot of foreign policy issues, particularly issues in the Middle East. And I think that that's ultimately what they want. That's really what the neocon movement is about.